Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Friday Reads video. This is where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any bookish things that have gone on during the week. There have not been a whole lot of bookish things this week. We're kind of in that summer mode. If you are in the United States, we're heading into a sort of holiday long weekend. Maybe. I'm sure a lot of people probably have to work on Monday since the 4th of July is on a Tuesday this week. If you follow along, you remember in my last Friday Reads video, I talked about how Joel and I are actually going away this weekend and we'll be gone through Wednesday because July 5th is our 10th wedding anniversary, which I'm really excited about. And we have not been back to the place where we got married since we actually had the ceremony. So it's going to be very nice to be back there. I did manage to film a video this week just because it feels like a lot of people have gone into vacation mode this week, so I had a little extra time and I was able to film a video that I am going to schedule for Monday, so you can look forward to that. And I am going to try to either today as I'm filming this or tomorrow. I'm filming this on Thursday because I'm going with my new plan of filming Friday Reads on Thursday and then editing them on Friday and scheduling them for Saturday. So it's Thursday. If I have time later today, I might try to film another video that I can schedule for Thursday of next week. And if I don't, maybe I'll have time tomorrow where I can do it. And if I have time to edit it before the end of the day, great. If not, it'll be fine because everybody was really nice and supportive and pointed out I shouldn't stress myself out to try to make sure that there's content. And I appreciate that. I want to try to do it if I can, but I'm not going to push myself and make myself uncomfortable just to get it done. I did, speaking of summer and vacation, because a lot of people feel like they're about to go on vacation and begin summer adventures, I did a video about the best summer reads for adults. There have been some interesting comments about what other people have recommended. I will link that video down below. I also did my book haul for June this week, and it was a lot smaller than other book hauls that I have done this year, but I think the quality of the books is good. I'm really interested. I've read one of them, and I'm really interested in reading the others, which is good for a book haul. Hopefully you're interested in reading all of the books that you talk about. But yeah, so that will also be linked down below. And that's pretty much all the bookish stuff that's gone on. Let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of this video. I really enjoyed last week because there were not a whole lot of book-related things going on in the world. We had a little more time to spend on the books, and I enjoyed that. So let's do it again. I finished 3 books this week, and I'm feeling really good about that. So again, I'm filming this on Thursday, which is June 29th. I think it's very unlikely that I'm going to finish anything else in the month of June. So this is probably how my Pride Month reading is going to end. I don't think I'm probably even going to start anything tomorrow because I am just going to focus on wrapping up work since I'm going to be out for part of next week, wrapping up and setting up things for the channel and for you and getting ready to leave on Saturday morning. So I don't think I'm even going to start anything. I finished 2 of those books just this morning. And so they're still very fresh, but also that means that I would have to start something tonight. I'm probably just going to wait and let this be the end of Pride Month. It's a very strong way to end my Pride Month reading. I actually did really well on my Pride Month reading, but I'll talk about the monthly wrap-up when Joel and I get back from Canada because, we are probably going to, when we get back, do a monthly wrap-up, and then you'll hear about what Joel read for Pride Month. And it'll be interesting to compare notes because he read some books that I want to get to. And I can't remember if we've read anything in common this month off the top of my head. But yeah, so when we get home, we will do our wrap up and I'll talk about how I did with my Pride Month pile of possibilities. I actually did pretty well. But more about that later. And then we will also film our best books of 2023 so far. That will all be coming after we get back. So the first book that I managed to finish this week was Flamer by Mike Curato. This is something that I picked up from Montana Book Company on Independent Bookstore Day because it is one of the more banned books in the country right now, and for that reason I wanted to get a copy and support the book. It is a graphic novel Set in, I believe, 1995, and I didn't know that when I picked it up. I just thought it was about a boy at camp who is sort of at a crucial age where he is not quite reckoning with his sexuality, but he's really struggling with it and who he is. He's about to begin high school, and that was all I knew about it. He's having a lot of struggles with that. I didn't realize it was set in 1995, and it's actually inspired by things that Mike Curato himself experienced at summer camp around that age, and it really resonated with me because I'm not that much younger than Mike Curato. I was entering high school in the 90s as well, maybe I think 2 years later than he did. So it felt like my own experience at that age in a way. And mine was a little bit different because if you follow along, you might remember I have a gay father, and he came out when I was 11. So there are ways in which my experience is different from a lot of other people's, but still just my own approach to myself was very similar to what the protagonist of this book experiences, and the sort of confusion, because this is a world where there was no real meaningful media landscape for queer people. When you had representation, it was usually very stereotypical, usually pushed to like B plots or subplots, not taken very seriously, and it didn't have a lot of quality representation. I remember sometime around that time, there was a gay character on Melrose Place, and they really hyped the fact that there was going to be a kiss, and they kind of cut away from the kiss and really cheapened it, so it's kind of like, And that's basically, you would just get scraps thrown at you, and you were supposed to be happy. And there was, again, no good, positive representation. This was like before Ellen, before Will and Grace, and any of that stuff. It's how I felt about myself at the time. And so I felt very seen by that. There is a bookmark in here, by the way, because Joel had been about to start this, and I left the bookmark in for him, but it's kind of falling out. So I'm just going to move it back. So I read this really quickly. I think I picked it up on Sunday, or maybe it was Saturday, and just was done really quickly. If you are someone who wants to know, like, why, of course, there's queer content. That's the real reason people would want to ban this. But I imagine the sort of fluff argument that is used is language, because there's a lot of cursing among these teenagers, and there actually is nudity, because one of the things that's so awkward for this character is that there are communal showers at this camp where he is, and he feels extremely awkward being around other boys who shower, and he is a little bit chubby, so that's part of it, but it's also that he's afraid that he's going to be interested. He's afraid that they are going to see him looking. So he's very like, it's an incredibly stressful thing for him. And thankfully, when I was that age, I never had to deal with communal showering or anything like that. But I was terrified that it was something that could potentially happen. And changing for gym class in the locker room was like wildly terrifying for me. So anyway, I found a lot to relate to in this book. And I really enjoyed the experience of reading it for that. It does kind of wrap up a little easily at the end in a way that kind of almost defies belief. And I don't want to spoil anything, but I will say almost in the way that like a sitcom will have a heavy issue resolved by the end. It kind of does that, but I think it manages to earn that in a way. And of course, because he is struggling so much, and because the kids have sort of identified him as someone who could potentially be gay, he's referred to by gay slurs throughout the book, and it does lead to suicidal ideation. So if that's a trigger for you, you should know that it is in this book. But I do think it's strong enough that it can carry that sort of easy resolution. It's not an easy resolution. I shouldn't call it that. And again, no spoilers. But I did really enjoy this book, and I'm glad I picked it up. And it makes me think, so if you remember in my last Friday Reads video, which will be down below, I talked about Wash Day Diaries, which is also a graphic novel, and how it felt like I wanted more. This is a good example of a book that it doesn't allow itself to be afraid about having more pages or like a larger page count. It's not actually a large page count at all. It's 364 pages with the afterword. It is definitely allowing itself time to set a mood, get into detail, and allow the character time to experience things and have setbacks, and all of that. So this is definitely a graphic novel that has meat on its bones, and it doesn't feel like it's just being superficial and sort of hinting at issues without actually grappling with them. And I think that's part of why it sort of earns the ending that it has. And I'm going to stop talking about it because I don't want to end up spoiling it for anyone who could potentially read it. So that was the first thing that I managed to read this week. And then I spent Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday reading 2 other books, one on audio and one in physical form. I decided I wasn't ready to get back to Stone Butch Blues yet, and then I debated between the library book I have, which is When We Were Sisters by Fatima Asghar, and My Government Means to Kill Me by Rasheed Newson. And I ended up doing this one. My concern had been that because this really deals with activism during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, and that it comes from a Black queer perspective, so someone who was doubly prejudiced against, I was worried that it would be a little bit heavy for my mental and emotional state right now. So I told myself, try a chapter, maybe try 2 chapters, and see how it's going. And I think I was much more concerned about how heavy this would be than it actually is. It turned out not to be a very difficult read. It didn't really stress me out too much. I mean, it does definitely stir some rage, which it's supposed to. It does make you angry and sad in ways that are appropriate given the way things went in the 1980s and the way things... It gives you hope for the way that things have gotten better, but it also makes you a little bit frustrated for the ways that we're still struggling with some of the same problems. If you're unfamiliar, this is the story of Trey. His real name is Earl Singleton III. He goes by Trey, and part of that is that he's left his family in Indiana behind, and he really wants nothing to do with them. This is not necessarily a circumstance where he came out to his family and they disowned him. He is much more actively disowning his own family. He comes from money and privilege. His parents both have sort of high-profile jobs. His father is a lobbyist for a pharmaceutical company. His mother is sort of a speechwriter slash political strategist. She has worked with Jesse Jackson, and the way they handle their children sort of reflects their own careers. And he is increasingly dissatisfied with who they are, how they handle the world, and he has decided that he wants to move to New York City to allow himself to be gay without judgment, and he leaves behind the trust fund that they had for him. So he's trying to make it on his own, and of course that is a huge struggle. And he meets a guy really early on named Gregory, who is also a person of color and also gay. And they end up being roommates for the duration of the novel, which really takes place over the course of about a year. It starts in 1986 and it gets to about halfway through 1987 in New York City. And it's really also about activism, because when he arrives, he's sort of not uninterested in what's going on, but he's 18 years old. And he has an 18-year-old's disregard for bigger news items and politics and all of that stuff. So he pretty quickly falls in with like a bathhouse in Harlem and goes and has a lot of anonymous sex. And it's interesting because from today's perspective, it's easy to try to like judge someone back then. It's like, how could you not really be aware of this plague that was going on at the time? How could you not be aware of the danger that you were putting yourself and other people in by having all of this anonymous and unprotected sex in the middle of a plague? Hi, Editing Greg wanted to jump in and just add something to this, which is just to say that in 2023, obviously we have been through another plague, and I think the experience of that both complicates and deepens our understanding of Trey and the way he sort of tries to go about his life in the middle of his own plague. And it raises questions of personal responsibility and just, I think we can also all understand the desire to continue living your life without restriction. So I just wanted to add that, and back to the rest of the video. But the book does a really great job putting you in the mindset of someone who was 18 at the time, or just someone who was potentially closeted at the time, because he meets a lot of people who are enduring that situation, and how desperation about trying to find ways to find release and acceptance can lead you to do reckless behavior and not get engaged, and how easy it is to maintain a sort of obliviousness to the world that is going on around you and think that it doesn't apply to you, even when you do hear about it. So over the course of the novel, he does have an awakening to activism, and he ultimately becomes involved in ACT UP and protesting. And one of the other things that's really interesting about this book is that it really dives in and reckons with all of the compromises and levels of activism. How some people are like Larry Kramer. They're very outspoken, they're very angry, and that can turn a lot of people off. But there are also people who go along to get along and maybe push a little bit, but don't want to make waves necessarily. Or there are people who do want to make waves, but they want to do it the polite way. I think the book refers to assimilationist gays a lot of the time, and that's kind of what they mean by that. It's like they don't want to offend anyone, so they just kind of want to be friendly with the people who are discriminating against them and not doing anything to improve the situation with the plague that was going on at the time. One thing I will say about this, so there are a lot of footnotes in this book relating to actual things that were popular in queer culture in the 80s, or historical figures and details about them and their lives throughout it. Like it will reference a song and then it will talk about that artist. And like Prince is mentioned at one point, and it will talk about how ultimately in the beginning of his career, he supported gay people and sort of actively flirted with androgyny and fluidity. And then later in life seemed to turn against that. Like that's a footnote. Historical fiction is always interesting. And I always have a bit of a problem because especially when an author has done a lot of research, and Rasheed Newson has done a lot of research, it sometimes feels like the book sort of bends and twists to have real life historical figures come into the book. And this definitely does that. Mostly it gets away with it, but there are circumstances where it feels a little bit much. And that's a big complaint that it's actually kind of a minor thing, I guess, because ultimately I really did like this book. I'm doing that thing where I liked something, but I'm about to, find tiny little details to complain about until it seems like I didn't like it. So let me be clear, I did really like this book. One of the things that really stood out to me, though, was that early on, when Trey discovers this bathhouse in Harlem, he meets Bayard Rustin, who was a real-life historical figure who was part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He is most famous for having helped organize the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. But even by the time that march happened, Bayard Rustin had been sort of forced out of the movement because of his homosexuality. So one thing that kind of bothered me about this is that there is a footnote the first time he meets Bayard Rustin that says there's really no evidence that he ever went to a bathhouse in his life. And, is it possible that he would have? Sure, it is. And it also has a footnote about how he was partnered with someone for long term. And again, I don't know a lot about Bayard Rustin's life. Maybe he did have that kind of open relationship, but I feel like when you put someone in a situation where and then admit that there's no evidence that they have done anything like that, it makes me start to wonder, in my, pick things to death type of way, why not just create a fictional character inspired by this person? Because this is a real person with a real life, and for the sake of accuracy, you're kind of playing with a story. And I don't think that's Rasheed Newson's intent. I think that's more my, well, if we don't know that he did this, why are we doing it? Why not just create a fictional version of this person? And that comes in later where Trey is taken to a dinner party with his roommate, where his roommate likes to pick up white men who are sort of sugar daddies, and he takes Trey to a party where Trey doesn't know this, but there are two closeted gay men who are sort of looking for, and his roommate is trying to get Trey to do the same thing that he does. And one of the guys that is trying to pick up Trey is William F. Buckley Jr., a conservative. You probably know who he is. But the footnote is, there's actually no evidence that this man was closeted or anything like that. Trey is really, because this is taking the form of a memoir that Trey wrote later in life. So the footnote is, there's no evidence that William F. Buckley Jr. was gay. Trey's kind of going out on a limb. He's the only person making a claim like this. And again, it just kind of makes you wonder, why not just have a fictional, not that I'm trying to protect William F. Buckley Jr., don't get me wrong, but why not just have a fictional character here? Why are we blurring the line anyway? I get in my head about this type of thing, clearly. Hi again, Editing Greg is back. I must have vacation brain because I forgot to mention one of my points about this, which is that if you listen to the audiobook, you don't have these footnotes, which means you also would not get the context that the footnote provides. And I think that is one of the things about this that bothers me. If you read the book, hopefully you read the footnote and you get that context that kind of tells you how things actually are. But if you don't read the footnote, or if you don't have access to the footnote because you're listening to the audio, you don't get that crucial piece of information. And I think a lot of people who are unfamiliar with, say, Bayard Rustin or William F. Buckley Jr., could potentially end up with false information about who they were and what they did. And not that this is important false information, but I like that the footnote adds the context. I worry about what happens if people don't get the context. That's all. Why Bayard Rustin is integral is that he sort of becomes a bit of a mentor toward getting Trey into this activist life. But the book does a lot to reckon with compromises that you have to make as an activist, when you might have to sacrifice someone that you love or care about, or sacrifice yourself for the good of the cause, and how maybe things change. There's a sense that, you have to give up a lot, and you have to give up parts of your own humanity for the cause. And ultimately, Trey has to make decisions about how much of himself he wants to sacrifice in order to be a good activist, and whether or not he has to give up those parts of himself, or if he's going to end up just perpetuating cycles that other people have decided you have to do in order to be a good activist. And that part is really interesting. I was thinking that I had enough little details about this that it was going to be like a 4-star read, and the ending of the book is actually, I would say, extremely strong, and it ends up really reckoning with complicated family issues, which I love, and issues of parenthood and chosen family, and that question of what you have to sacrifice to be a good activist, and it also calls back to, if you're not an activist, it will speak to you, because in order to be good at your job, maybe, what are the things about yourself that you have to sacrifice to do that? We all have to face these compromises at some point, to some degree, so we can find that relatable. And I think the book ends incredibly strong and made me a lot less willing to pick it apart because of these little details that I've discussed at length. I'm really glad that I read this book. I think it was absolutely perfect reading for Pride Month, and I would absolutely recommend it to you. It ends up reading extremely quickly. I was very much in my own head about whether or not this was going to be a heavy book because of the subject matter, and it's actually a kind of enjoyable read. And I love how Rasheed Newson allows Trey to be a complicated figure who is flawed, who makes mistakes, who is occasionally unlikable, and occasionally will do things that infuriate you. And yet by the end of the book, you really respect him, even if you are sometimes frustrated by him, because you understand he's doing his best. He's trying to be a good person in sort of outlandish circumstances where he is discriminated against, not just because he's gay, but because he is Black. And all of the things that he has to compromise, and the ways in which the movement will try to use him and exploit him. At one point, he is sort of sent to negotiate a deal with people because they are trying to be more inclusive of people of color, so they know that people will listen to him for that. But also, he is more in danger from, say, police violence because he is Black. So it's just a really interesting and layered and textured story about activism and life, and compromise and discrimination and queerness and family. And I really liked it a lot. Again, I felt like it was a perfect read for Pride Month. And if you've read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Rasheed Newson is currently engaged in the writer's strike. I don't remember what shows he has worked on. Bel Air, The Chai, and Narcos. So hopefully he will be releasing another novel at some point, and I would be very curious to see what he does next. Then this morning I also finished the audio I had been listening to, and I had been listening to this for like 2 weeks, I think. I hadn't made any progress in it when I did my last Friday Reads video, and that was not much progress at all. It's Only This Beautiful Moment by Abdi Nazemian. I was only, I think, partway through the first chapter for the last 2 weeks when I did Friday Reads videos, and I finally just got into it this week, and I'm really glad that I did. I had been wanting to read another Abdi Nazemian book since I read Like a Love Story, which was one of my favorite books, I think 2 years ago at this point. Fantastic book. Also deals with activism and AIDS in the 1980s among teenagers, but in a very different way, and I love it. So I had been really wanting to read another book by Abdi Nazemian. This one is newly released. It's just out. It's in hardcover, but the hardcover is like $19. I liked it so much that I actually called Montana Book Company, and they are going to get me a copy of this book. That's how much I liked it. Sometimes when I really liked a book, I want to show support for it. So I had listened to it on audio through Scribd, but I want to have a copy of the book, and then I can have it on my shelf next to Like a Love Story. So this is a generational saga of family and family secrets and queerness. And if you know me, you know that those are like catnip for me. So it's 3 generations of this family. The grandfather was in the United States in the 1930s, I believe, and his mother is actually a white woman. He is mixed race. His father was Iranian, and she is really pushing to get him into Hollywood, and he gets a contract with MGM. In the more present day storyline, you have his grandson. The grandfather is now back in Iran and is dying. And the grandson and his father are now going to Iran to visit. But you don't know how the grandfather ends up back in Iran. That's something that gets teased out throughout the book. And then the father is growing up in Iran and becomes, it's interesting how books will create parallels to each other. He is a student, but he is also an activist in the revolution that was going on in Iran in the late 70s and 1980, trying to create good change. And he ultimately has to be sent back to the United States to protect himself because he's sort of identified as one of these protesters. And that's not a spoiler because that part is explained pretty quickly, that's how he ends up back in the United States, where the grandson grows up. The grandson's name is Mahmoud, but he prefers to go by just Mood. So, and the father is Saeed, and it creates all of these really interesting dynamics and levels of activism because the storyline with the grandfather in Hollywood in the early days of Hollywood also gets at this kind of activism and what it is to live an authentic life and struggle to find places for yourself in a society that would rather you not exist. And that's really interesting. And it teases echoes of that in the other storylines because they're all in a way trying to find a safe way to exist. And the grandson, Mood's storyline, is really interesting as well because he has grown up in the United States, but he feels displaced. Even though he was born here and grew up here, he feels othered and he doesn't feel like he fits in a lot of places. And going back to Iran is really interesting for him because he feels connected to his culture in a way that he never has before. And at the same time, he is terrified to go back because it's illegal to be gay there. And he is dating this, I don't know how to explain his boyfriend without being mean. His boyfriend is this sort of social justice warrior white person who is like your basic nightmare of an overzealous social justice entitled warrior. who tells him, it's like, you can't go back to, you can't go back to Iran when they would probably kill you if they knew who you are, which, I mean, is real. And the book does a good job grappling with, like, that is a legitimate concern, but at the same time, have compassion for the community there. And when Mood ends up in Iran, he meets a community of people who are underground in order to live authentic lives and express themselves, which also mirrors the storyline from Hollywood. And it's just so cleverly and intricately done, and it has so many layers, and I really enjoyed it a great deal, in case you can't tell. And it's difficult because there's no way to really talk about this book without starting to unfold those layers, so I'm going to try to leave it at that and not really allow the story to complicate even more. But it's also a very empathetic story, and it's about learning to understand people and how you can think that you're protecting people by not discussing things that have happened to you, hiding your own traumas or hiding family secrets, and how you're only really free when you openly discuss who you are and what has happened to you, and how that can create connection. You know, in the beginning of the novel, these three men are disconnected from each other, and the story is sort of a journey to them understanding each other and learning to connect, and I found that very profound and beautiful and really well done. So that's another book by Abdi Nazemian that is a huge success for me, and I just loved it. I need to sit with both of these books to sort of decide where they sit on my best books of 2023, if they factor in at all. Luckily, I have another week to do that before Joel and I will film our video, but I really enjoyed all three of the books that I finished this week. It was a really rock-solid way to end Pride Month reading, because, again, there's only one day left in June as I film this, so the odds that I would get anything else in are, like, non-existent. So I'm probably just going to take tomorrow and not start anything until Joel and I get on the road on Saturday. I don't think I'm going to jump into When We Were Sisters while we travel. I'll probably leave the library book here. I was able to renew it, so I have it until, I think, the middle of July. So I have a little more time to read it. So I'll get to When We Were Sisters after Joel and I get back. I can't remember because I've filmed so many videos this week. I think in a video that's coming next week, I will discuss this further, but I actually was given access to Jessamine Ward's book, Let Us Descend, on NetGalley. So I might read that while we're traveling, just so I don't have to take a physical book with me, but also because I really, 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 really want to read it. And I haven't decided what the audio will be, so that's probably what I will be working on this next week. I hope if you live in the United States, you know, the 4th of July is a weird holiday. It has a lot of weird feelings attached to it, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is. So if you live in the United States, I hope you manage to have a good day and enjoy some type of celebration, however you would like to do that. If you're not in the United States, ignore this. But anyway, I do have at least one video that will be ready for you next week. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your support, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.